You know, when we think about history, our minds usually jump to kingdoms, cities, big buildings. But there's this whole other story, one that's written across mountains and deserts. It's the story of the shepherds of the seasons, the nomadic people who live their lives completely in tune with the rhythm of the land. And believe me, their story holds some pretty surprising lessons for us today.
And look at this. This isn't just a pretty landscape. For these communities, this is their livelihood. For them, movement is life. It's a story of incredible resilience and a really deep understanding of ecology. But it's also a story of a huge clash with a modern world that just didn't get it. So let's start at the beginning, with the rhythm of their world.
Okay, so to really understand the world of these pastoral nomads, you kind of have to throw our calendar out the window. Theirs is dictated by the sun, the snow, the rain. It's a life lived in perfect sync with the land around them.
And this journey, it really shows you how incredibly planned their movements were. This was never just random wandering. Take the Gaddis shepherds, for example. Their annual migration was basically a masterpiece of logistics. They'd spend winter down in the low hills, and then, come April, they'd start this massive trek north to these lush summer meadows. Then, in September, the whole cycle reverses, with a perfectly timed stop along the way to harvest their crops.
This picture really gets to the heart of their lifestyle. This is a Gujjar mandap. It's a temporary home, but it's also a workplace where they'd make ghee from the milk their herds produced. And this constant movement, it wasn't just about finding food. It was just so incredibly sustainable. By moving on, they let the pastures recover, which made sure the land would be healthy for them when they came back.
And this wasn't just happening in one place. All across India, different communities had their own unique rhythm. Up in the Himalayas, you had the Gujjar Bakarwals, who literally followed the snow line. On the plateaus of Maharashtra, the Dhangars had this amazing relationship with settled farmers. Their flocks would manure the fields right after the harvest, and in return, the farmers gave them grain. Then in the deserts of Rajasthan, the Raikas combined herding with farming. It was a world that worked together.
But this world, a world built on cycles and movement, was about to slam into a totally new force, one that believed in things being permanent, settled, and in drawing straight lines on a map. I'm talking about colonial rule.
So, you've got to ask yourself, what happens when this fluid, moving world collides with a rigid world of rules and revenue? Well, the answer, as it turns out, would change absolutely everything.
So here's the fundamental conflict. For the pastoralist, movement was everything, and land was a shared resource. But for the colonial administration, a population that stayed put was just way easier to control and, tax. They looked at these huge grazing lands and saw wasteland because it wasn't making them any money. This wasn't just a simple disagreement, it was two completely different realities on a collision course.
So the colonial government started building fences. But here's the thing, these weren't made of wood or wire. They were invisible fences, built from laws and regulations that were designed to box the nomads in and take their way of life apart, piece by piece.
This quote from a colonial official back in 1913, it reveals the entire mindset. He's arguing that a forest used for grazing is useless because you can't use it for timber. In their eyes, grazing wasn't a smart use of the land. It was an obstacle to making a profit. The first invisible fence was just relabeling their land. Through these wasteland rules, the government took over the pastoralists' grazing grounds, called them unproductive, and then handed them over to individuals to be turned into settled farms. Just like that, ancestral lands were suddenly off limits.
The next fence went up around the forests. A bunch of different forest acts classified forest as reserved, where no pastoralist was allowed, period, or protected, where your movement was super restricted with permits. These forests, which had been so important for their animals during certain seasons, were now basically closed for business.
And then there was, maybe the cruelest fence of all, the one they built around their very identity. See, the British were deeply suspicious of people who moved around. The Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, it branded entire nomadic communities as criminal, by birth. Their entire way of life was literally criminalized, forcing them into settlements where the police were watching them constantly.
And this wasn't just some local issue. This map shows how communities all across the subcontinent, from the Gujars up north to the Kurugas down south, all felt this squeeze as their world just began to shrink around them. But to see just how global this pattern was, we need to travel to a whole other continent. Let's go to Africa, and let's talk about the story of the Maasai.
So, Africa is home to over half of the world's pastoralists. We're talking 22 million people whose lives depend on herding. Communities like the Berbers, the Somali, the Turkana, and the ones we're focusing on, the Maasai, they all faced a very similar tightening of the world around them.
So how much did this actually affect them? Well, for the Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania, the number is just staggering. The colonial powers drew these random lines right through their territory. They created settlements and game reserves, and in the end, the Maasai lost 60% of their pre-colonial lands.
And the result of that was catastrophic. Their best grazing lands were taken for settlements or turned into famous national parks like the Serengeti. The Maasai were pushed into these dry, arid zones with terrible pasture. The consequence was inevitable: a devastating shortage of food for their animals and, in turn, for their families.
And that feeling was universal. A herder in Namibia put it this way: "We are imprisoned. We are in jail. The borders press us heavily." Those invisible fences were just as real as iron bars, and that feeling of being trapped was felt by pastoralists all across the world.
So with their world shrinking and their entire way of life under threat, did the pastoralists just vanish? Not at all. This isn't a story of disappearance. It's a story of incredible adaptation and resilience.
And they were unbelievably resourceful. Some of them just reduced their herds to match the smaller pastures. Others started combining herding with trade. They forged completely new routes. The Raikas, for instance, couldn't go to Sindh after 1947, so they just found entirely new migration paths into Haryana. And, so importantly, they began to organize and fight for their rights.
So what can we take away from this incredible story of survival and adaptation? What's the enduring wisdom of these shepherds of the seasons?
After all this, it brings us back to that one central question. We've seen what happens when you restrict movement, so what is it about this nomadic life that is so absolutely essential?
The answer is something that ecologists today widely recognize. This is one of the most sustainable ways to live in dry and mountainous regions. That constant movement is the key. It allows pastures to rest and regrow. It prevents the land degradation that we see in so many other places. It's a brilliant adaptation, perfectly suited to its environment.
And that leaves us with this final, really powerful thought. Far from being these relics of the past, pastoralists hold a deep knowledge about how to live sustainably. Their story isn't over. It's a continuing journey of adaptation, reminding all of us that there are many, many ways to live in harmony with the rhythm of the land.